So today we are on our Thursday podcast. We are talking about stress and the endocrine impact of stress. Okay. So again, I want to reiterate during these times, I want to reiterate a few things. First of all, we shouldn't be fearful. Remember, as I've said before, fear is an acronym. False evidence appearing real. That alone can cause a lot of stress, okay? So we don't need to fear, and we need to focus on things that we can control. And if you watched my Health Solutions episode on the radio a few weeks ago with my brother, he talked about there's basically two things we can control, and it's our attitude and it's our effort. And believe me, I know I need help on both of those all the time because it's these times can be very, very frustrating and stressful to myself. So during these times, we need to do our best to take care of ourselves. So we're going to be going through some slides today. Hopefully you guys can see them on your end, and I'm going to go through some objectives. The slides will be available after the show too, so you'll have access to them. And as always, message us on Facebook or YouTube. Let us know if you have any questions while we're streaming. We stream live on Facebook and on YouTube. We also archive these episodes on those formats. Actually, on YouTube, we archive them after they've been edited, and we also archive them on all the podcast forms. So, SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, all those, you can go there and listen to these podcasts. So please go there, like them, review them, subscribe to them, and so we can keep this going. So, following along. So, the objectives of today is you're going to learn about our physiological response to stress, and you're going to be able to recognize the endocrine impact and how the endocrine system works. We're not going to get too technical today. I myself, I don't like to get too technical. I like to keep it in simple terms, and that's whether I'm talking to the lay public or healthcare providers. I like to keep it simple because I'm simple. How does it affect? How does chronic stress affect us? And what are things that we need to look at in laboratory values or things that we can tests that we can do to see if we are stressed? And of course, probably the most important thing, what are some things that we can do to affect how we respond to the stress? We can't always change the stress that's in our life. It's how we respond to it. So if you're looking at that slide, 75% of diseases prevalent in Western society today are related to the stress mechanisms of the body. What does that mean to me? That means that most diseases are preventable. And we've known this for years. And if you look at our sick care system in healthcare, we're not very good at preventing disease. We're pretty good at putting out fires for diseases. So, if you've got diabetes, let's give you insulin. If you have arthritis, let's give you an anti-inflammatory medication. Let's not talk about the things we can do to prevent diabetes or to prevent the arthritis. So we typically, our traditional healthcare system is a sick care model. And if you look at what's going on in the country right now, it is truly, truly the fact that it's the sick care model. So, and at times we're pretty good at that, but we're not very good at preventing things. So what is stress? There's really two types of stress. There's many different subsets in those, but we have physical stress and we have mental stress. Now, in the past, if you look at ourselves as through an evolutionary period, if you look at the past of how we were supposed to respond to stress in the past, think about us getting, a lion chasing us. Okay, we responded to stress. We would respond to stress in two different ways. You either fight or you flight. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail when we get to how the adrenals respond, and we'll even talk about the adrenals. So, and those are pretty common. Now, mental stress, and I didn't live back then, and I don't know how good our history is to write about back then, but I got to think some of the mental stress was a little bit different, because they didn't have the stress of a job, commuting to work. I mean, not that they didn't work. Don't get me wrong. They worked very hard, hunting and gathering. But the stress of some of the things that we have in today's society, like a commute to work or all the stresses at work, it was a lot different. So they didn't have a lot of that chronic mental stress, possibly, and they might have just dealt with it differently due to the way they responded with their diet and their attitudes. So, what are some symptoms? If you look at some symptoms, what are some symptoms that you might be stressed? Waking up in the morning feeling tired and not feeling refreshed. Feeling tired most of the rest of the day. Needing coffee, soda, caffeinated drinks, or sugary snacks to get going and keep going. Boy, isn't that common in our society today. I was driving yesterday, headed home from work, and this is at 5 something at night, and the line at Starbucks was going around the block. So what does Starbucks have? They have caffeine and they have sugar in them. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. So when you look at how our country really survives a lot on sugary drinks, Monster Energy drinks, Red Bulls, whatever, or Starbucks, you look at that and you look at how our country and our people in our country might be really stressed. So also just feeling exhausted, and your mind continues to race, filled with anxiety. How many people these days are on anti-anxiety medications? How many people use alcohol to cope? Which does decrease anxiety because it is a CNS depressant. And remember, what causes anxiety? If you think about what causes anxiety, is most of the things that cause anxiety is fear of the unknown. Well, let's remember what fear is, okay? So let's not get scared of things we don't even know are going to happen. So some other things, aging too quickly, poor digestion. And if you were with us the last couple episodes, our special episodes here, we talked about the importance of gastrointestinal health, and that is probably trumps everything. You can't absorb your nutrients if your gastrointestinal health is not optimal. So you can't absorb your nutrients from food, micronutrients, macronutrients, so we can so our bodies can repair. Struggling to lose weight in spite of dieting and exercise. This is a very, very common one that we see. Patients that just can't lose weight, yet they seem to eat a low-calorie diet and they seem to be exercising. This could be an endocrine response issue, okay, an adrenal issue. Achy muscles, joints or tensions in the body, neck and shoulders especially. Diminished sex drive, decreased libido. So if you think about it, if our bodies are under a lot of stress, it makes sense that we would have a decreased sex drive. Why? Because if our bodies are under a lot of stress, the last thing our bodies would want would be to procreate and possibly create more stress. So that is a big, big issue when it comes to decreased libido, is stress. It's not always, which it is a hormone issue because we're talking about adrenal hormones, but it's not always a testosterone issue. And speaking of that, we will be talking about that in a few weeks also. Feeling depressed, lack of motivation, getting sick more frequently, decreased immune health. I mean, if we are under chronic stress in our body and we're not taking the appropriate actions, our body cannot respond well, and we will have a decreased immunity to many things. Let's think about this. Cancer. We're all talking about viruses and bacteria recently, but think about cancer too. When you look at cancer, our immune system fights cancers off all the time. We are bombarded with all kinds of carcinogens, okay, all over. And our body just normally fights them off. If we have a decreased immunity, a decreased immune system, we will not be able to fight off those carcinogens. And many times when I ask patients when they, had breast cancer, for instance. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, okay? But I'm just giving some general examples. You talk about a patient, it's like, oh, so yeah, I got breast cancer when I was 39. Okay, well, what was going on in your life? Was there anything going on in your life? Any kind of stress? Well, you know what? My son had died like 6 months before that, and then the stress response happens, and then you have decreased immune system because you're chronically stressed. So that is not that uncommon of a story. A car wreck or a loss of a loved one, a divorce, all those things can cause the stress response can cause disease. Uh, so when you think about what the stress response is, we have in our body, we have three different glands when we want to talk about the stress response. So we're going to call it the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland. It's also called HPA axis dysfunction, all right, or adrenal dysfunction. Adrenal is only one part of that. You've got the hypothalamus that talks to the pituitary, that talks to the adrenal glands. For the purpose of our discussion, and I might get some people out there that aren't going to like this, but for the purposes of our discussion, I am just going to use the terms HPA axis dysfunction and adrenal dysfunction in the same way. Okay, they're not the same, but you treat them the same pretty much. So, but realize that it's a very complicated system, and you could do a master's thesis on it. So, and we don't have the time. Nor I don't have the knowledge to do that anyway. So we're going to focus mostly on the adrenals, but just realize that, it's the HPA axis that we're really talking about. All those parts have to talk. All those parts have to talk to each other for us to be able to respond to stress. Now let's talk about the adrenal glands. Adrenal. Ad means above, renal means kidneys. So they're little pea-sized glands that sit on the top of the kidneys, okay? And they produce hormones in response to stress. The word adrenaline comes from adrenal gland. So adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, it comes from the adrenal gland. Cortisol is also produced in the adrenal gland, okay? And cortisol when you think of cortisol, it's more of the one to get us through the general stressors of the day. It's not the one that we need right now when a tiger or a lion is chasing us. That's more of epinephrine, although cortisol will be released also. So when our bodies respond to stress, when you think about what happens if a tiger or lion was chasing us, we should, those hormones our adrenal glands should pump up hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, to prepare us to either fight that tiger or fly or run from that tiger. Okay. And then when that stressor goes away, the levels should come back down to baseline or be normal throughout the day. So if that is not working properly, we could be on overload, because when our stress is too high, our levels will be too high all the time. So that the next slide really just talks about the what happens in stages of stress. So like you can call it stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So if you're in stage 1 is you're basically being stressed a lot. There's a stress in your life that's not going away. You're on overload. Your adrenal glands are pumping out too much cortisol, and your body is responding in an appropriate way. Sometimes in stage 1, these people will feel great. I mean, think about it. Their stress hormones on high. So sometimes they'll feel okay. Now, they might have a hard time sleeping at night because their cortisol is high. So they're kind of under stress, so they can't be sleeping at night. That is not a good thing, of course. So then you go into stage 2, where the cortisol kind of starts fading out. And then stage 3 is when they can't produce cortisol hardly at all anymore. So we're going to go into that a little bit more here shortly. So if you look at the next slide, the normal diurnal range of cortisol. Okay, we are diurnal. Humans are diurnal. We're not nocturnal. We are meant to work during the day and sleep at night. So our cortisol should peak in the morning when we start waking up, and then it should go down slowly throughout the day until it should be lowest at like 2 o'clock in the morning, when we should be in deep sleep. And if you look at that graph, what that graph is showing is, now there's a range. That's kind of what the graph is showing. So there's a top range and a bottom range. But in general, your cortisol should be following this pattern, okay? If you look at the next slide, an abnormal cortisol rhythm, what you'll see is cortisol high in the morning, and it goes down slowly throughout the day like it should, but then it kind of goes up through the night. And then usually those are patients that are going to have a hard time sleeping. And remember, sleep is where we get our recovery. So if we're not sleeping, everything's going to be messed up. So it's important, important to sleep. So how do we measure cortisol? So there's two or three different ways. There's more than that, but I'm going to talk about two. We're going to talk about serum cortisol. Serum is you have to have a blood draw. One of the problems with having a blood draw is it's a blood draw. It's a procedure that has to be usually done by, some kind of, you had to go into an office and get your blood drawn. So usually it's first thing in the morning was I recommend a blood draw. A one-time blood draw of cortisol in the middle of the day, I don't think it has much value. So I think a morning cortisol is important because that shows how you're responding for at least to prepare yourself for the day. I'm a big believer in saliva for testing cortisol, and here's why. If we want to find out what somebody's cortisol is doing in the morning, at noon, at dinner time, and right before bedtime, we would have to do 4 serum draws to get those levels, or we could do it in saliva. Now, first of all, as you can imagine, doing those 4 blood draws during that day and having to go to a lab and get them drawn, that alone is going to increase stress response. So I don't think it's not the most convenient. It's invasive, and it can be a stressor in itself. If you're already drawing blood, it's not that hard to add a cortisol to it. So if you already have drawing a morning blood, with other hormones, then I don't think it's a bad idea to add a morning cortisol to it. But if you're just doing it to try to monitor cortisol levels 4 times throughout the day, I don't think it's the most convenient way. So in saliva, it's easy because saliva is easier to collect. It's an in-home test. You basically spit into a tube. You do it in the morning, at noon, at dinner time, and at bedtime, and then those samples get sent off to a lab, and then the results come back. And we're trying to map out what the cortisol is doing all day long. Saliva also, just a little tidbit, saliva also tests free levels. Unbound in our blood, we have what's called we have proteins, and depending on the hormone, it depends on what sticks to them. But we have proteins in our blood that certain hormones bind to. And if they bind to those hormones, they won't be free to work at the receptor sites. So it's important to test free levels. Well, saliva already does that. And saliva is also a tissue, so it might be more representative of tissue levels rather than what's in our blood, because just because something's in our blood doesn't mean it's necessarily in our tissue where the substances need to work. We should also include in this test a fasting glucose. DHEA. DHEA is a hormone that is produced in the adrenal glands in response to stress, helps us respond to stress. So it's usually produced along with cortisol. DHEAS, the sulfated form, is the one that is kind of the active form that floats around in the blood. And both these things affect glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. Now, what are those? We're going to get into that a little bit later when we talk about minerals and vitamins, but that is because they are mineralocorticoids, they do affect, and glucocorticoids, they affect glucose, and they affect the minerals in our body. So with this glucose, one of the things we're testing for also is that if you have too high of fasting glucose, you might also have insulin resistance. So an insulin level is not a bad thing to check. And of course, insulin resistance means that you are producing a lot of insulin in response to stressors, mostly increased glucose. So you produce insulin to lower that glucose, and that can lead to diabetes. And insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, there are so many diseases that are related to that. So that's why it's so important to get these things under control, because these responses are what happens to our body and a lot of other diseases are caused. So some other things to test are our thyroid function. I'm going to talk about the hierarchy of the glands a little bit later on in the talk, but just really brief: TSH, free T4, and free T3. I like all 3 of those, not just TSH. If anybody listening or watching is on thyroid medication, they might see that their TSH is checked. That is maybe a good screening tool, but I will talk about next week. I'll talk about in a thyroid presentation about why it's important to get a complete thyroid panel and the importance of free T3. So make sure you're getting those tests also. Also vitamin D, check your vitamin D. It's 25 hydroxy vitamin D levels. I'm going to talk about in the talk next week on Thursday on vitamin D also. So tune in next week to learn more about thyroid and vitamin D. Those things are very important. So when we talk about cortisol is a mineral corticoid. What does that mean? It it holds on to minerals in the blood, including sodium and including some other things. So when your cortisol levels are high, you basically need more minerals. And also more vitamins also. I mean, if you think about it, your body is on stress, so you need more minerals, you need more vitamins. So diet during these times is so important, and possibly supplementation if need be. Um, and here's what's important also. So if you look at the intracellular micronutrients, what does that mean? That's just a fancy name of talking about the nutrients inside the cell. There's some pretty cool tests that we can do now that will test the nutrients that are inside the cell. Why is that important? Well, think about what a serum blood draw is. So when we draw blood for anything, whether it be hormone levels or whether it be vitamin levels, we draw venous blood. What is venous blood? We draw the blood and then we spin it out to get just the serum part of it, okay? But what is venous blood? Venous blood is blood that is taken away from the liver. It's been detoxified and taken away from the liver to be. It's already been processed. So we got to think: is that the blood that we really want to test? Is that the levels we really want to test? Because that's not really what's really in the tissue and what's really in the cell, and that's where most all these things happen is inside the cell. So there's good technology now to use. To be able to test what levels of nutrients are in the cell. So if message us on Facebook if you want more information about that. It's super cool technology. The next slide, it gives me a headache. I don't know if it gives you a headache, but there's a lot going on there. And there's two purposes to this slide for me that I wanted to get across is that if you look at the very top of the slide, not the very top, but the second one down, you got acetyl-CoA and cholesterol. Cholesterol, the villain of everybody's disease in America, right? Well, here's proof right here. Without cholesterol, we will die. Cholesterol is needed in every cell in the body, and you're going to hear a lot of these things be repeated. I talked about this last week, but you're going to hear this repeated because I want everybody to know about it. Cholesterol is not the villain. Cholesterol is essential to our health, and without it, we will die. It's essential for brain function. It's in every cell in the body. We produce hormones from cholesterol. So there's some thought that when our cholesterol, most patients start having cholesterol now, it's getting younger and younger all the time. But it used to be, 30 years ago when we started testing cholesterol, it was usually patients in their 40s and 50s that started getting elevated cholesterol levels. Now, I find it interesting that elevated cholesterol levels you get after your hormones start declining. So is your body trying to respond and say, hey, we need more hormones, so we're going to hold on to cholesterol more? I don't know. I think it's a reasonable theory. Interesting thing is that why are we having younger people in their 20s and 30s with low cholesterol or with high cholesterol levels now? My opinion is because of our crappy lifestyles. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing low hormone levels. We're seeing men in their 20s with hormone levels of men that are in their 70s. So I think it's just part of our lifestyle. Again, the great news is we can control that. We don't necessarily need to go on an anti-cholesterol medication. I'm not a big fan at all of the statins, and this is one of the reasons why. So and the other thing is I just wanted to, that slide is just a reminder that all these hormones work together. So I call it the hormone symphony. So they have to be in balance in order for our bodies to work optimally. Here's just some other symptoms that I'll go over quick of things that we see. Just think about these diseases that we treat in a traditional healthcare setting. Pain, Loss of libido, we talked about that already. Poor memory, lightheaded when standing. That makes total sense. If we have low cortisol levels, cortisol hangs on to salt, which sodium chloride, sodium, which will hang on to water. So we're going to get lightheaded on standing, headaches, alcohol intolerance, and think about alcohol intolerance. Think about how you drink more alcohol when you are if you're responding if you want trying to respond to stressors, especially anxiety. You will sometimes patients will use drugs or alcohol. Insert any drug there. Insert any anti-anxiety drug there, and you could say the same thing. So tenderness in the low back, cold intolerances. Cold intolerances could be due to low thyroid, which says stress is affected by thyroid. What are some other ones I want to show? Low blood pressure makes sense on when we with the mineralocorticoid. Muscle wasting, atrophy, not being able to build muscle, not being able to recover in the gym. These are all signs of too much stress. And if you think about what cortisol does, cortisol is a catabolic hormone. Okay, what does catabolic mean? It breaks down our bodies. Catabolic as opposed to anabolic. Testosterone is an anabolic hormone. Testosterone helps to build our bodies up. So it helps build muscle mass, build bone mass. Cortisol does the exact opposite. So when somebody takes cortisol, when somebody takes like prednisone, you guys have heard of that for like arthritis, for instance, with some of these diseases that may be caused from inflammation. When somebody takes prednisone, they can have osteoporosis, bone loss. They can have muscle wasting. So they're completely different than the the anabolic steroids that we would talk about. So um, cortisol can have some long-term, not so good effects. So it's important to realize that. So that's why you could see osteoporosis, you would see depression, uterine fibroids. It's also another hormone imbalance. We'll be talking about that in the future. Of course, some thyroid stuff there. So that's why these things are so very, very important. And stress affects so many things. Uh, okay, um, so what are some common sources of stress? Okay, on the slide, the physiological aspects of cortisol and DHEA. Basically, with that slide, I just wanted to show you, just like we're talking about, just how many things are really affected there. There's a lot of these systems that stem from the adrenal dysfunction, and it affects a lot of different other things, a lot of different things. So we have to get that in balance first. Some of the stressors, blood sugar issues, inflammation, mental, emotional stress. We talked about physical stress. We're going to talk about sleep too. That's a should be a no-brainer. So we're going to talk about things that we can control, though. Management. First, first and primary is things we can change. Lifestyle changes. So the most important thing, I believe, is probably sleep. So the physical, that's when our body repairs and regenerates itself. I also call sleep recovery because it's really the same thing. So it's not just sleep. We'll talk about some deep sleep and when we sleep at night, but think about this too. Rest is important in general. I mean, when we talk about high caliber athletes, training for the Olympics, their bodies, even though they can eat, they can have a dialed in diet and they can eat enough calories and even get enough micronutrients and macronutrients. Their bodies can only tolerate so much physical stress. So they need rest, and their coaches will tell them about rest. And it's not just to sleep at night, although that's when the major recovery happens. It's also what we do when we are resting. So if we're, are we taking breaks? Are we resting at night? Are we, getting away from social media? Are we getting away from electronics? That constant stuff is stress. So when we go home at night, do we have a period where we just are off all kinds of social media, off all kinds of electronics, and maybe even no TV? I think those are things important to remember because that is part of our rest and recovery. So, but when we talk about sleep, let's talk about what we normally think of as sleep. So, most of our body's repair takes place between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And I just want to mention one thing. If you guys really want to hear a great podcast on sleep, Rhonda Patrick has a great podcast on sleep. And Matthew Walker, when she interviewed him, he talks, that's his specialty is sleep. And it's an amazing, amazing podcast. And we realize how important sleep is. So that's when physical repair and regeneration takes place a little bit later. Under ideal circumstances, we would get 8 hours of sleep, and we would also be to bed by 10 o'clock at night. Now, I think that can be debatable or whatever if something else fits your schedule, but maybe 9 to 11. Think about it as 9 to 11. And then, you would get up between 6 and between 5 and 7 in the morning. So that's under ideal circumstances. I know that's not always possible. Think about the things that happen when we don't have good sleep. I call these the dirty dozen. Elevated cortisol at bedtime. You're gonna have a hard time sleeping at night. So low output or timing with melatonin. Cortisol, stress hormone, is inversely proportional to melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone that helps us sleep at night, okay, and put us into REM sleep. Cortisol high, melatonin low. Melatonin low, cortisol high. So if your cortisol is high at night, that means your melatonin is low. So there's two things we need to do. Maybe get the cortisol level up or get the melatonin level up and get the cortisol level down. And there's lifestyle changes can make that happen. So low levels of progesterone. If you have low levels of progesterone as a female, and it's not just progesterone, is not just for, I know it's controversial, but males have progesterone also, and it can help with some of their sleep issues. You will have sleep issues if you have low levels of progesterone, and it's not just women that are premenopause or perimenopause or postmenopause that have low levels of progesterone. There are many women in their 20s that have low levels of progesterone. And some of the issues that they would be dealing with would be infertility, irregular cycles, insomnia, headaches, especially following around their cycles. Those are all symptoms suggesting low progesterone. Caffeine and other stimulants, you take those at night. That's a problem. Not for everybody, but it is for most. So try to limit your caffeine intake at night. Exercising too late in the day, that's definitely a problem. Everybody's affected differently, so they kind of have to set a set time. For me, I don't like to do any kind of intense exercise at least start it after 7 o'clock at night, because it will definitely affect my sleep. I like the one I thought I saw it in here, but anyway, alcohol. Alcohol is a problem. Okay. A lot of people say, well, I like to have a few glasses of wine at night because it helps to relax me. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but here's what I suggest. I suggest that you try not drinking and see how much better you sleep. Here's the problem with alcohol. It wears off after about 4 hours. So how many people have ever had a few drinks and they feel great going to sleep because it is a CNS depressant. It relaxes our bodies. And then 4 hours later they wake up. Guilty. I'm definitely guilty of that. Happens all the time. So be very careful of alcohol. Partner snores. Those are things that can definitely affect sleep. Sleep apnea can definitely affect sleep. Restless leg syndrome. So realize all those. So moderate exercise and cortisol. Moderate exercise, any kind of exercise, should increase your cortisol level. We will talk a little bit more about movement, nutrition, and rest in a few episodes down the line. But this talks about moderate exercise and cortisol. I think what's important thing is that you know how to help your body recover, because it's not that intense exercise is bad. It's not at all. In fact, I think there's a very, very good reason for it. There's been lots of studies on that, that you will respond better to intense exercise, but it can't be all the time, because that alone would be a stressor on your body. Okay, so the other lifestyle change that we can do with sleep disorders is our sleep hygiene. And here's what's really good to look at when we look at our sleep. Here's what's important. If you listen to the podcast with Matthew Walker, you'll get a lot more idea on it. But it's depth of sleep, it's continuity of sleep, and it's also regularity of sleep. So how deep are you sleeping? How long are you sleeping? Duration too. So depth, duration, continuity, and consistency. If you think about that, how long are we sleeping? Okay, that's duration. What's the depth of the sleep? Are we like waking up a little bit all the time because our partner's snoring? What's the duration of it? How many hours of good sleep did we get? And how many nights do we do that? That would be more the consistency of it. So those are the four important factors with sleep. So here's some other things, just dietary wise. It talks about um, um, teens who skip breakfast more likely to be obese, and I think that's probably not that surprising necessarily. And this just goes to show how important our diet is, and we need to eat good whole foods, nutrient dense foods, and skipping breakfast is not necessarily a good thing. Now, I will tell you this: there's some diets are specific to each individual. They need to be personal, and there's a lot of argument that intermittent fasting is good. I don't know if it'd be good for a teenager necessarily. Depends on the teenager. But definitely as adults, I think intermittent fasting definitely has some definitely good benefits. So think about things that we can do as diet to not fluctuate our blood sugar. Would be more frequent, smaller meals, um, less decreased carbs, especially processed carbs. Um, so our blood sugar is not spiking like that, like up and down. Um, And let's see, fiber. Fiber is another thing that can be very important for preventing the spiking of our blood sugar levels. Um, if you think about when we eat whole fruits like berries, or when we eat an apple, those they're high in sugar. There's no doubt about it. But why do they not have a really high glycemic index? I know that's all relative, but it's because they have fiber. So that fiber doesn't let the sugar spike, which doesn't allow the insulin to spike, which can then cause a lot of other problems. So let's see here. So our normal cortisol production should definitely be uh, um, definitely be highest in the morning, slowly go down throughout the day, being lowest at 2 o'clock in the morning. Um, I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly now. I talked about adrenal exhaustion already, and stage 2 and stage 3 of adrenal exhaustion. I think what's important now to realize is that there are three things that we can kind of control with the stress: how we react to it, but our diet, our how we move, because how we exercise will decrease. Will help our bodies stay strong, and then sleep, of course, will help our bodies recover. So one thing I do want to, as I finish up this topic, is the hierarchy of our glands in responding to stress. So we're talking about the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands, okay? But our body, if you look at the last slide here, our body has many other um, glands that need to work with the adrenal glands, or with this axis, to be in balance. And I'm just going to give an example of a few of them. They are your thyroid, so your adrenals, your thyroid, and your ovaries and your testes. When you think about those glands, they follow a hierarchy, which means this: without our adrenal glands, we will die. So if you're going to pick one of those to get into balance, the most important one would be your adrenal glands. Secondly, your thyroid gland is kind of the second in the echelon. Our thyroid gland, we can live without a thyroid. We won't live optimally, but we can replace hormones with when our thyroid's gone, and then we'll be better. Um, and then our sex hormones, which would be our our ovaries or our testes. We can definitely live with those, not very optimally. But there again, it just shows how the adrenal glands trump it all. If our adrenal glands are not in balance, then our thyroid and our um, sex hormones will not be in balance. So I think the important thing is to know how all those work together and to get them in balance appropriately. Because usually there is, I mean, like I say, the adrenals are the most important, but usually there might be a little bit of an imbalance in all of them, and you could maybe use a overall hormone balancing. So just to reiterate what we talked about, how important diet, nutrition, and sleep is with adrenal gland recovery. Also, movement. We will talk all about all three of those later, and just the overall hormone cascade. There are things that you can do when you think about some of the things that some of the diseases like arthritis and osteoarthritis or um, other diseases of that are inflammatory in response. A lot of those are due to adrenal dysfunction. So there are things that you can do to help that decrease that inflammation in your body and possibly prevent those diseases. So as always, listen to us Monday morning, 1 to 2 p.m. Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. We will be live on the radio, AM 1470 KBSN, and we would appreciate callers. You can call in to that radio show, 509-765-1470, and follow us here on Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for listening.